May 28, 1940. Hall Estate, 60 kilometers north of Berlin. The morning sun filtered through the expansive windows of Hermann Göring's opulent study as the Reichsmarschall examined the latest intelligence reports from America. His pudgy fingers, adorned with stolen rings from conquered territories, drummed impatiently against the mahogany desk while his aide presented the overnight cables from German operatives in Washington. Among the routine diplomatic communications lay a transcript that would soon trigger the most dismissive laughter heard in the Reich's highest circles that year. President Franklin Roosevelt had just announced an ambitious aircraft production goal to Congress, calling for American factories to manufacture 50,000 military aircraft annually. The audacity of this pronouncement struck Göring as both desperate and delusional, coming from a nation he considered industrially backward and militarily impotent. His knowledge of American manufacturing capabilities, filtered through Nazi propaganda and ideological blindness, painted a picture of a decadent democracy incapable of serious military production. The Reichsmarschall's worldview, shaped by years of totalitarian thinking, simply could not comprehend the industrial potential that lay dormant across the Atlantic Ocean. As Göring read Roosevelt's words aloud to his gathered staff, his voice crescendoed into genuine, hearty laughter that echoed through the marble corridors of his palatial residence. 50,000 aircraft, he bellowed, slapping his thigh with theatrical amusement. These Americans believe they can simply wish airplanes into existence like their Hollywood fantasies. His subordinates, trained in the art of sycophantic agreement, joined their leader's mirth, treating Roosevelt's announcement as the desperate bluffing of a weak democracy facing the industrial might of the thousand-year Reich. The Nazi leadership's fundamental misunderstanding of American capabilities ran deeper than simple military intelligence failures. Their ideological framework prevented them from recognizing the revolutionary potential of democratic industrial mobilization. Göring, despite his experience as a World War I pilot, had become convinced that aircraft production required the kind of regimented, centralized control that only fascist states could provide. He viewed American automobile factories as fundamentally incompatible with aircraft manufacturing, believing that the mass production techniques pioneered by Henry Ford could never be adapted to create the complex, precision-engineered warplanes that modern combat demanded. This contemptuous dismissal reflected a broader Nazi delusion about American society and its industrial capacity. German intelligence reports, corrupted by ideological bias and wishful thinking, consistently underestimated American manufacturing potential while overestimating the effectiveness of German production methods. Göring's inner circle reinforced these misconceptions, creating an echo chamber where American industrial capabilities were systematically minimized and German superiority was taken as an article of faith. The Reichsmarschall's laughter that May morning would soon transform into stunned silence as American factories began demonstrating production capabilities that defied every assumption held by Nazi leadership. The irony of Göring's dismissive reaction would become apparent within months, as American industrial mobilization began accelerating at a pace that German planners had deemed impossible. Roosevelt's 50,000 aircraft goal, which had seemed like desperate propaganda to Nazi ears, was actually a conservative estimate of what American democracy could achieve when properly motivated. The president's announcement marked not the beginning of American industrial ambition, but rather the public declaration of a transformation that was already underway in factories across the United States, guided by immigrant expertise and powered by free labor. What Göring failed to understand that morning was the fundamental difference between totalitarian and democratic approaches to industrial mobilization. While Nazi Germany relied on slave labor, coercion, and centralized command structures that stifled innovation, America was preparing to harness the voluntary cooperation of millions of free workers, many of them women who would soon prove their capabilities in roles previously reserved for men. The Reichsmarschall's laughter represented the sound of fascist arrogance confronting democratic potential, unaware that this confrontation would ultimately determine the war's outcome through the awesome power of American industrial production. While Göring celebrated his perceived superiority in the comfort of Hall, 3,000 miles away in Detroit, A 61-year-old Danish immigrant named William Knudsen was quietly revolutionizing American industrial capacity in ways that would soon shatter every assumption held by Nazi leadership. Knudsen, who had arrived in America as a penniless 20-year-old bicycle mechanic, had spent 4 decades mastering the intricacies of mass production at General Motors, where he had learned to coordinate vast networks of suppliers, workers, and assembly lines with mathematical precision. His appointment by Roosevelt as director of the Office of Production Management represented the kind of meritocratic selection that totalitarian regimes, with their emphasis on party loyalty over competence, simply could not replicate. The transformation that Knudsen orchestrated challenged every Nazi assumption about American industrial weakness and democratic inefficiency. Within weeks of Roosevelt's aircraft production announcement, Knudsen had begun implementing conversion plans that would turn automobile factories into aircraft manufacturing centers, applying the same mass production principles that had made America the world's leading automotive producer. His Danish immigrant's perspective, shaped by experiences of starting from nothing and building through persistence and innovation, brought a unique understanding of American industrial potential that native-born executives sometimes took for granted. This outsider's clarity would prove essential in recognizing possibilities that seemed impossible to more conventional thinking. Knudsen's approach differed fundamentally from German industrial organization, which relied on rigid hierarchies and centralized control that often stifled the kind of innovation and adaptation that American production required. Where German factories operated under strict state oversight that discouraged worker initiative, Knudsen encouraged bottom-up problem-solving and rapid iteration of manufacturing techniques. His experience at General Motors had taught him that the best production improvements often came from factory floor workers who understood their machinery and processes better than distant planners, a lesson that would prove invaluable as American factories began adapting automobile assembly lines to aircraft production requirements. The scale of transformation that Knudsen envisioned defied every prediction made by German intelligence analysts, who consistently underestimated American industrial capacity while overestimating the time required for factory conversions. Nazi planners, accustomed to the inefficiencies of centralized command economies, could not comprehend how quickly American manufacturers could retool their facilities and retrain their workforces when motivated by the combination of patriotic duty and profitable government contracts. Knudsen's network of relationships throughout American industry, built over decades of successful business partnerships, enabled coordination and cooperation at speeds that German bureaucrats deemed impossible for democratic societies to achieve. As spring turned to summer in 1940, Knudsen's preliminary production surveys revealed manufacturing capabilities that even optimistic American planners had not fully recognized. Major automobile manufacturers like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler possessed not only the physical infrastructure needed for aircraft production, but also the skilled workforces and supply chain relationships that could be rapidly adapted to military requirements. The Danish immigrants' methodical assessment of American industrial capacity was uncovering production potential that would soon make Roosevelt's 50,000 aircraft goal seem conservative rather than ambitious, transforming Nazi laughter into stunned disbelief. The irony of America's industrial mobilization being led by an immigrant would not be lost on observers who understood the fundamental differences between democratic and fascist approaches to talent utilization. While Nazi Germany increasingly relied on forced labor and rejected the contributions of those deemed racially inferior, America was demonstrating the competitive advantages of inclusive societies that rewarded merit regardless of national origin. Knudsen's success represented everything that fascist ideology rejected: the triumph of immigrant ambition, democratic meritocracy, and voluntary cooperation over nativist prejudice, authoritarian command, and coercive control. By autumn of 1940, Knudsen's preliminary reports to Roosevelt contained production projections that would have seemed like fantasy to German planners, still convinced of their industrial superiority. American factories were not merely preparing to meet the president's 50,000 aircraft challenge. They were positioning themselves to exceed it by margins that would fundamentally alter the global balance of power. The Danish immigrant who had arrived in America with nothing but ambition and mechanical skills was orchestrating an industrial transformation that would ultimately determine the outcome of humanity's greatest conflict through the awesome power of democratic mobilization. By early 1941, as German intelligence continued to dismiss American industrial claims as democratic propaganda, Henry Ford was breaking ground on a manufacturing facility that would embody everything Nazi ideology claimed was impossible in capitalist democracies. The Willow Run bomber plant, stretching across a mile of Michigan farmland, represented an engineering and logistical challenge that German planners would have deemed unachievable without slave labor and totalitarian control. Yet Ford Motor Company, working with Knudsen's Office of Production Management, was preparing to demonstrate that free workers motivated by patriotic duty and fair wages could outproduce any coercive system that fascist regimes could devise. The Willow Run facility challenged every assumption about aircraft manufacturing that had guided military thinking since the Wright brothers first achieved flight. Traditional aircraft production, whether German, British, or American, relied on skilled craftsmen working in relatively small facilities, where each airplane was essentially hand-built, using techniques that had changed little since World War I. Ford's revolutionary approach would transform aircraft manufacturing into an assembly line process similar to automobile production, where standardized components moved through precisely timed stations, while workers performed specialized tasks with mechanical precision. This industrial democratization of aircraft production represented exactly the kind of innovation that totalitarian bureaucracies, with their rigid adherence to established procedures, were structurally incapable of implementing. Construction of Willow Run proceeded at a pace that astonished even American observers familiar with Ford's legendary efficiency. The main assembly building, measuring 3,200 feet long and 1,200 feet wide, enclosed more floor space than any manufacturing facility previously constructed anywhere in the world. German intelligence reports, filtered through ideological disbelief, consistently underestimated both the scale of American construction projects and the speed at which they were being completed. Nazi analysts, accustomed to the bureaucratic delays and resource shortages that plagued German industrial projects, simply could not comprehend how American contractors were simultaneously building dozens of massive manufacturing facilities without the kind of centralized command that fascist theory deemed essential for large-scale coordination. The logistical challenges of Willow Run operation would have overwhelmed German production planners already struggling with wartime resource shortages and transportation bottlenecks. Ford's facility required the coordination of 1,600 suppliers delivering components on precisely timed schedules to maintain continuous production flow. Raw materials arrived by railroad car, while finished bombers departed by their own power, creating a supply chain complexity that demanded the kind of voluntary cooperation between independent companies that Nazi economists claimed was impossible without state coercion. This network of suppliers, each operating according to profit incentives while serving national defense requirements, demonstrated the superior efficiency of market coordination over bureaucratic command in achieving large-scale industrial objectives. As Willow Run neared completion in early 1942, Ford engineers were finalizing production procedures that would transform B-24 Liberator bomber manufacturing from a craft process into an industrial operation. Each aircraft, containing over 1 million individual parts, would move through the assembly line in precisely timed stages, while workers performed repetitive tasks that could be learned in weeks rather than the years required for traditional aircraft craftsmanship. This de-skilling of aircraft production represented a fundamental democratization of manufacturing that enabled rapid workforce expansion using workers with minimal prior experience, including the thousands of women who would soon prove their capabilities in roles previously reserved for male craftsmen. German observers, when they finally acknowledged the reality of Willow Run's existence, initially dismissed it as another example of American quantity over quality, assuming that mass-produced aircraft would inevitably be inferior to the handcrafted precision of German manufacturing. This contemptuous attitude reflected the broader Nazi failure to understand how American quality control systems could maintain high standards even in mass production environments. Ford's inspection procedures and testing protocols ensured that assembly line aircraft met or exceeded the reliability standards of traditionally manufactured planes, while being produced in quantities that German factories could never approach, even with unlimited slave labor. The ultimate goal of Willow Run operation, to produce one complete B-24 bomber every hour, represented a production rate that German planners would have dismissed as physically impossible had they not been confronted with overwhelming evidence of American achievement. This hourly production target, once achieved, would enable a single American facility to manufacture more heavy bombers in 1 month than German factories could produce in an entire year, fundamentally altering the mathematics of aerial warfare and industrial competition. Ford's mile-long factory was preparing to demonstrate that democratic capitalism could mobilize resources and coordinate production at scales that totalitarian systems, despite their theoretical advantages in central planning, simply could not match through coercion and state control. As 1942 progressed and American industrial mobilization accelerated beyond even optimistic projections, a demographic transformation was occurring in American factories that challenged every Nazi assumption about gender roles and industrial capability. Millions of American women, responding to both patriotic duty and economic opportunity, were entering manufacturing jobs previously reserved exclusively for men, demonstrating production capabilities that fascist ideology claimed was impossible for the supposedly weaker sex. This feminine industrial revolution, symbolized by the iconic Rosie the Riveter, would soon prove that democratic societies could mobilize human resources more effectively than totalitarian regimes bound by rigid social hierarchies and ideological prejudices. The scale of female workforce participation in American aircraft manufacturing defied every prediction made by German social scientists who had dismissed women's industrial potential as biologically limited and socially disruptive. By mid-1942, women comprised over 30% of aircraft workers, a percentage that would climb to 65% by the following year as male workers joined military forces and female workers proved their exceptional aptitude for precision manufacturing tasks. German observers, constrained by Nazi ideology that relegated women to purely domestic roles, initially refused to believe intelligence reports documenting the extent and effectiveness of American female industrial participation, dismissing such claims as impossible democratic propaganda. At Willow Run and similar facilities across the United States, women were mastering complex manufacturing processes with learning speeds that impressed even skeptical male supervisors who had initially questioned female mechanical aptitude. Riveting, welding, and precision assembly work required not the brute strength that traditional gender stereotypes emphasized, but rather the manual dexterity, attention to detail, and patience for repetitive tasks at which women often excelled beyond their male counterparts. This discovery of previously untapped human resources provided American industry with a massive competitive advantage that German planners, limited by their ideological blindness to female potential, could neither anticipate nor replicate within their own production systems. The social implications of America's feminine industrial mobilization extended far beyond immediate wartime production requirements, creating cultural changes that would permanently alter American society while demonstrating the adaptive capacity of democratic institutions. Women working in aircraft factories were earning wages comparable to male industrial workers, gaining economic independence and technical skills that challenged traditional assumptions about gender capabilities and social roles. This economic empowerment of female workers represented exactly the kind of social dynamism that fascist ideologists claimed would weaken national unity. Yet American production statistics proved that inclusive workforce policies actually strengthened, rather than undermined, industrial effectiveness. German industrial planners, struggling with chronic labor shortages despite their use of slave workers from occupied territories, remained ideologically incapable of implementing similar female workforce mobilization strategies. Nazi doctrine, with its rigid emphasis on racial hierarchy and gender subordination, prevented German factories from accessing the productive potential of their female population, creating a self-imposed disadvantage that would prove increasingly costly as the war progressed. While American women were demonstrating their capabilities in precision manufacturing roles, German women remained largely confined to agricultural and domestic work, representing a massive underutilization of human resources that no totalitarian efficiency could overcome. The productivity achievements of American female workers were shattering stereotypes on both sides of the Atlantic, proving that democratic societies possessed hidden strengths that authoritarian regimes could neither understand nor replicate. Women at Willow Run were not merely filling positions vacated by male workers. They were often exceeding male productivity standards while maintaining quality levels that met the stringent requirements of military aviation. This superior performance reflected not just individual capability, but the broader advantages of voluntary cooperation over coercive labor systems, as motivated workers consistently outproduced their enslaved or conscripted counterparts, regardless of gender. By late 1942, American aircraft production statistics were beginning to reflect the full impact of female workforce mobilization, with monthly output figures that German intelligence analysts initially refused to accept as authentic. The combination of innovative mass production techniques, immigrant leadership expertise, and previously untapped female labor was generating manufacturing capabilities that exceeded even Roosevelt's ambitious 50,000 aircraft goal. Göring's dismissive laughter was being answered by the sound of millions of rivet guns operated by women, who were proving that democratic inclusion created superior industrial strength compared to fascist exclusion and authoritarian control systems. Autumn 1942 brought Hermann Göring his first confrontation with statistical reality that would begin cracking his fundamental assumptions about American industrial weakness and German superiority. Intelligence reports arriving at Luftwaffe headquarters contained production figures so extraordinary that Göring initially ordered them verified, convinced that Allied propaganda or German spy networks had somehow corrupted the data. American aircraft manufacturers were not merely approaching Roosevelt's 50,000 annual target. They were preparing to exceed it by margins that German analysts deemed mathematically impossible without the kind of totalitarian labor mobilization that democratic societies supposedly could not achieve. The Reich Marshal's study, once filled with confident dismissals of American capabilities, now witnessed increasingly tense conferences as Göring struggled to reconcile Nazi ideology with undeniable statistical evidence. American aircraft production for 1942 was projected to reach 47,000 units, a figure that represented more combat aircraft than the entire German Air Force possessed at the war's beginning. This production achievement, accomplished primarily by converted automobile factories using female workers and immigrant leadership, challenged every assumption about industrial organization that had guided Nazi economic planning since the party's rise to power. Willow Run's performance statistics were particularly devastating to German confidence in their production methodologies and labor systems. Ford's mile-long factory was approaching its target of 1 B-24 bomber per hour, a production rate that represented more heavy bombers monthly than German factories could manufacture in an entire year, despite their use of slave labor and round-the-clock operations. This single American facility, operated by voluntary workers earning competitive wages, was demonstrating productive capabilities that the entire German aircraft industry could not match through coercion and state control, fundamentally undermining fascist theories about the superiority of authoritarian economic organization. The broader implications of American industrial mobilization statistics were forcing German leadership to confront the possibility that their fundamental assumptions about democratic weakness and totalitarian efficiency had been catastrophically wrong from the beginning. American factories were simultaneously producing aircraft, tanks, ships, and munitions at scales that suggested industrial capabilities far exceeding German estimates, while also maintaining civilian production levels that kept American consumer markets functioning normally. This dual-track production achievement indicated resource abundance and organizational efficiency that totalitarian planners, struggling with chronic shortages and bureaucratic bottlenecks, found difficult to comprehend or replicate. Göring's personal crisis deepened as he reviewed comparative production statistics that revealed the true scope of American industrial advantages over German manufacturing capacity. While German aircraft production peaked at approximately 25,000 units annually, despite maximum mobilization efforts, American factories were preparing to double that output, using production methods that German engineers had dismissed as unsuitable for precision manufacturing. The mathematical reality was becoming inescapable. Democratic capitalism was proving superior to fascist socialism in the fundamental task of converting raw materials and human labor into military hardware. The psychological impact of these statistical revelations was compounded by reports from German pilots returning from combat operations over American-supplied territories, where they encountered aircraft quantities that seemed to increase rather than diminish, despite intensive Luftwaffe efforts. American production rates were apparently exceeding combat loss rates by margins that made strategic victory through attrition impossible for German forces already stretched thin across multiple fronts. This production arithmetic suggested that every German aircraft lost represented an irreplaceable strategic asset, while every American aircraft destroyed would be replaced by 2 or 3 new units within weeks of its destruction. As 1942 drew to a close, Göring found himself confronting the possibility that his May laughter at Roosevelt's 50,000 aircraft goal had been premature and catastrophically misinformed. American production statistics were indicating annual outputs approaching 70,000 aircraft, with projections for 1943 suggesting even higher totals as factory conversions completed and workforce training programs matured. The Reich Marshal's study, once echoing with confident dismissals of democratic capabilities, now witnessed stunned silences as German leadership struggled to comprehend industrial realities that their ideology had prevented them from recognizing until military necessity made denial impossible. 1943 brought the full flowering of American industrial mobilization that transformed Roosevelt's supposedly impossible 50,000 aircraft goal into a conservative underestimate of democratic manufacturing capability. American factories achieved production totals that shattered every prediction made by fascist planners who had dismissed democratic societies as inherently incapable of sustained large-scale coordination. The annual output reached 85,000 aircraft, nearly double the target that had provoked Göring's contemptuous laughter just 3 years earlier, while American quality control systems ensured that mass-produced aircraft matched or exceeded the reliability standards of traditionally handcrafted German planes. Willow Run had achieved its seemingly impossible goal of producing one complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, operating with mechanical precision that German observers found difficult to reconcile with their stereotypes of chaotic democratic inefficiency. The mile-long assembly line processed over 1 million individual components per aircraft, while maintaining quality standards that exceeded German manufacturing tolerances, demonstrating that democratic capitalism could achieve both quantity and quality simultaneously through voluntary worker cooperation and innovative production methods. This hourly bomber production represented more heavy aircraft than most German factories produced monthly, fundamentally altering the strategic mathematics of aerial warfare. The statistical comparison between American and German aircraft production had become so lopsided that German intelligence officers began questioning whether their data collection methods were somehow systematically flawed or compromised by Allied disinformation campaigns. German annual aircraft production, despite maximum mobilization efforts using slave labor and totalitarian command structures, peaked at approximately 25,000 units while struggling with resource shortages and transportation bottlenecks that democratic markets had efficiently resolved through price mechanisms and voluntary cooperation. American production exceeded German output by ratios of 3 to 1, while simultaneously maintaining higher quality standards and civilian consumption levels that kept domestic morale high. The broader implications of American industrial supremacy extended beyond aircraft production to encompass the entire spectrum of military hardware, revealing production capabilities that challenged fascist assumptions about economic organization and social mobilization. American factories were simultaneously producing tanks, ships, ammunition, and support equipment at scales that indicated resource abundance and organizational efficiency unmatched by any totalitarian system. While German industry struggled with chronic shortages of critical materials and skilled workers, American manufacturers operated with access to global supply networks and domestic labor pools that seemed inexhaustible compared to the constrained resources available to Axis powers. The human element of American production success particularly confounded German analysts, trained to believe that racial hierarchy and authoritarian control were essential for achieving large-scale industrial coordination. American factories operated with ethnically diverse workforces, including significant numbers of African Americans, immigrants, and women who had proven their capabilities in precision manufacturing roles that Nazi ideology deemed suitable only for Aryan males. This inclusive workforce mobilization provided American industry with human resources that German planners, limited by ideological prejudices, could neither access nor effectively utilize within their own production systems. Göring's personal reckoning with American industrial reality reached a crisis point as combat reports from multiple theaters confirmed that German forces were facing material disadvantages that no amount of tactical skill or strategic innovation could overcome. American aircraft were appearing over European and Pacific battlefields in numbers that seemed to increase rather than diminish, despite intensive Axis efforts, suggesting production rates that made traditional attrition strategies obsolete. The Reich Marshal, who had once dismissed American capabilities as democratic propaganda, was now confronting the possibility that fascist ideology had blinded German leadership to industrial realities that would determine the war's ultimate outcome. By the end of 1943, American aircraft production statistics represented not merely quantitative achievements, but qualitative transformations in how democratic societies could mobilize resources for national defense. The combination of immigrant expertise, female workforce participation, innovative manufacturing techniques, and voluntary cooperation had created industrial capabilities that exceeded the theoretical maximum production that German planners had calculated for totalitarian systems. Roosevelt's 50,000 aircraft goal, once dismissed as impossible democratic fantasy, had been surpassed by 70%, proving that free societies possessed hidden strengths that authoritarian regimes could neither understand nor replicate through coercion and state control. The final vindication of American industrial supremacy came not from Allied propaganda, but from the reluctant testimony of Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and wartime armaments minister, whose post-war revelations would confirm everything that Göring had refused to acknowledge during the conflict's darkest hours. Speer's detailed analysis of German production failures and American industrial advantages provided authoritative confirmation that democratic mobilization had indeed surpassed totalitarian efficiency by margins that Nazi ideology had deemed theoretically impossible. His testimony, delivered with the methodical precision of an engineer rather than the emotional rhetoric of a defeated politician, documented how American industrial capacity had systematically overwhelmed German manufacturing capabilities, despite every advantage that fascist theory claimed for centralized command economies. Speer's most devastating admission concerned the impact of American strategic bombing, which had achieved its destructive effects not merely through explosive tonnage, but through the industrial sustainability that enabled continuous operations at scales German planners could not comprehend. American bomber formations, supplied by production lines that replaced aircraft faster than combat could destroy them, maintained pressure on German targets with mathematical regularity that made effective defense impossible, given German resource constraints. The armaments minister's calculations revealed that American industrial capacity enabled sustained bombing campaigns that would have bankrupted German production capabilities, even if conducted with equivalent aircraft, demonstrating the decisive importance of manufacturing depth over tactical innovation. The statistical comparisons that Speer presented to Allied interrogators provided definitive proof of American industrial superiority across virtually every category of military production that mattered for modern warfare. American aircraft production had peaked at nearly 100,000 units annually, almost 4 times German maximum output, despite theoretical advantages of slave labor and totalitarian resource allocation that Nazi economists had confidently predicted would enable superior efficiency. This production differential represented not merely quantitative differences, but qualitative transformations in how democratic societies could mobilize resources when properly motivated by national purpose and free market incentives. Speer's analysis of German production limitations revealed structural weaknesses in totalitarian economic organization that American democratic systems had efficiently avoided through market mechanisms and voluntary cooperation. German factories struggled with chronic shortages of critical materials and skilled workers that resulted from bureaucratic inefficiencies and transportation bottlenecks that centralized planning had actually exacerbated rather than resolved. American manufacturers, operating through decentralized market coordination and voluntary supplier relationships, had achieved resource allocation efficiency that German state control could not match, despite theoretical advantages of unified command and unlimited governmental authority. The armaments minister's testimony also confirmed the decisive importance of American workforce mobilization strategies that had enabled unprecedented female participation in precision manufacturing roles that German ideology had reserved exclusively for male workers. This gender-inclusive approach to industrial mobilization had provided American factories with human resources that German planners, constrained by Nazi prejudices about racial and sexual hierarchies, could neither access nor effectively utilize within their own production systems. Democratic inclusion had proven superior to fascist exclusion in the fundamental task of converting human labor into military hardware. Perhaps most significantly, Speer acknowledged that German intelligence had systematically underestimated American industrial potential throughout the conflict, leading to strategic decisions based on false assumptions about democratic weakness and totalitarian strength that had proven catastrophically wrong when tested against wartime reality. American production achievements had consistently exceeded German projections by margins that suggested fundamental misunderstandings about how democratic societies could organize large-scale industrial efforts without the coercive mechanisms that fascist theory deemed essential for sustained coordination. Speer's final assessment provided the epitaph for Nazi industrial confidence and the ultimate vindication of Roosevelt's 50,000 aircraft goal that Göring had dismissed with such contemptuous laughter. American democracy had not merely met the production challenges of global warfare, it had exceeded them while maintaining civilian living standards and social cohesion that totalitarian systems, despite their theoretical advantages, could not replicate through state control and ideological manipulation. The armaments minister's testimony confirmed that democratic capitalism possessed industrial capabilities that fascist socialism could neither understand nor match, ultimately determining the war's outcome through the awesome power of free societies, properly motivated for national defense. The ultimate irony of Hermann Göring's dismissive laughter at Roosevelt's 50,000 aircraft goal would echo through history as the sound of fascist arrogance confronting democratic potential, unaware that this confrontation would ultimately be decided not by ideology or racial theory, but by the awesome power of free people working voluntarily toward common purpose. By war's end, American factories had produced over 300,000 military aircraft, a total that exceeded Göring's initial estimate by 600%, while simultaneously maintaining civilian production levels that kept American living standards higher than most European nations enjoyed during peacetime. This industrial miracle represented the complete vindication of democratic values over totalitarian efficiency claims that had once seemed theoretically sound to fascist planners convinced of their systematic advantages. The transformation of American industrial capacity from Roosevelt's ambitious goal to actual wartime achievement demonstrated fundamental truths about democratic mobilization that authoritarian regimes could neither understand nor replicate through coercion and state control. Immigrant expertise, symbolized by William Knudsen's leadership, had proven superior to nativist prejudice in organizing large-scale production efforts that required voluntary cooperation across ethnic and cultural boundaries. Female workforce participation had shattered gender stereotypes while providing manufacturing capabilities that fascist ideology had dismissed as biologically impossible, proving that inclusive societies possessed human resources that exclusionary systems could never fully mobilize for national purposes. The mathematical reality of American production supremacy had rendered obsolete every strategic calculation that German planners had made regarding attrition warfare and industrial sustainability in prolonged conflicts. While German aircraft production struggled to replace combat losses with chronically inadequate monthly outputs, American factories were producing surplus aircraft that enabled simultaneous operations in multiple theaters, while building strategic reserves that made defeat through material exhaustion impossible. This production arithmetic had fundamentally altered the nature of modern warfare, proving that industrial capacity, rather than tactical brilliance, would determine outcomes in conflicts between major industrial powers. Göring's personal journey from contemptuous dismissal to stunned recognition of American capabilities represented the broader Nazi failure to comprehend how democratic societies could achieve coordination and efficiency that exceeded totalitarian systems despite theoretical disadvantages of decentralized decision-making and voluntary cooperation. The Reich Marshal, who had once ridiculed American industrial potential as democratic propaganda, eventually faced the reality that free workers motivated by patriotic duty and fair compensation could outproduce slave laborers driven by coercion and fear, fundamentally undermining fascist assumptions about the relationship between freedom and productivity. The legacy of American industrial mobilization extended far beyond immediate wartime requirements to establish precedents for post-war reconstruction and Cold War competition that would vindicate democratic values throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The same industrial capabilities that had overwhelmed fascist production systems would later support Marshall Plan reconstruction efforts and NATO alliance structures that demonstrated democracy's capacity for sustained international cooperation and mutual assistance. Roosevelt's 50,000 aircraft goal, once dismissed as impossible democratic fantasy, had evolved into permanent American industrial advantages that would shape global power relationships for decades following the conflict's conclusion. The final measure of democratic triumph lay not merely in quantitative production achievements, but in qualitative demonstrations of how free societies could mobilize resources without sacrificing fundamental values or social cohesion that gave those societies their strength and purpose. American workers had produced unprecedented quantities of military hardware while maintaining civilian liberties, democratic institutions, and social progress that totalitarian regimes claimed were incompatible with effective national mobilization. This integration of wartime efficiency with peacetime values represented the ultimate vindication of democratic principles over fascist alternatives that promised order and effectiveness at the cost of freedom and human dignity. History would record Hermann Göring's laughter at Roosevelt's aircraft production goal as the sound of totalitarian delusion confronting democratic reality, marking the moment when fascist confidence began its inevitable transformation into stunned recognition that free societies possessed industrial capabilities that no amount of coercion or ideological fervor could match through authoritarian control. The Reichsmarshal's contemptuous dismissal had been answered by the most comprehensive demonstration of democratic industrial supremacy in human history, proving that voluntary cooperation among free people represented humanity's most powerful force for achieving common objectives that required sustained effort and unlimited creativity.